सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
We are talking about the proposed amendments to the Indian Institutes of Management Act of 2017. These proposed amendments have just been placed in Parliament today. You know, I keep saying to you that we often see our Parliament not functioning, adjournments, noise, and we feel embarrassed. The fact, however, is that behind all that din, Parliament is where the business of governance actually takes shape, because everything the government does through the year is based on the powers given by Parliament. So even for them to exercise those powers, those have to be legislated first, and that is there in Parliament. So that's why when a Parliament session is on, every day we get a gift, and that gift is some new laws or some new amendments. Now, one of those today is a very key set of amendments. This is an amendment to the Indian Institutes of Management Act 2017. So of the bunch of documents I'm carrying with me besides my yellow sheets, this is the original Indian Institutes of Management Act of 2017, brought in by the Modi government itself, when it was hailed as a very forward-looking, very reformist step, because that act actually empowered the IIMs, their board of governors, etc., to be as autonomous as any institution has ever been in the Indian system. Very autonomous. They took away most of the levers of control that the central government might have had on these IIMs. That had been the demand of the IIMs for a very long time. That said, the other white sheet of papers I'm carrying is this set of amendments that's been tabled today in Parliament. These amendments, when these pass, and government has the majority, so it's likely that this will pass. These amendments, when these pass, will take away a lot of the elements of autonomy that these IIMs, 20 existing IIMs, had been given in the 2017 Act. In fact, not only will these take away several key elements of that autonomy, they will also bring back to the central government, sort of in a convoluted but very sure-footed, in a very convoluted and sure-footed way, the powers or levers of power back to the central government. That is the Ministry of Education or the central government or the cabinet, however they choose to exercise those levers of power. So those powers are being given formally to the government. In the past, there was a lot of confusion, so powers were often misused, and IIMs complained that they didn't have sufficient autonomy. Then Modi government came with this really welcome law in 2017 that all of us hailed editorially. That formalized really solid autonomy for the IIMs. Now it looks like, as happens with all establishments, once you give a lot of freedom, after a while the establishment starts feeling the loss of power. And when the establishment starts feeling the loss of power, then you find ways of restoring your own powers after having given away, because after all, what is reform? Reform in the government system is to give away your own powers. That is the old line we keep on using. Government has no business to be in business. But after a while, if you feel a loss of power, then you start getting into business, then you stop privatization, or you start making further taxpayers' investments into your own companies where you are in business, as we've just seen in BSNL, etc. That said, we have to see what these amendments are. These amendments basically are about governance of these institutions. So 20, there is one amendment which is also important, and that is completely non-controversial and non-political. That I can mention to you first, because I will mention 10 points for you. That amendment is to give the status of a full-fledged Indian Institute of Management, or IIM, to an institution in Mumbai. That is the very well-known Mumbai-based institution called National Institute of Industrial Engineering. That has now been given the status of a full-fledged IIM. It will issue degrees, etc., etc. It will now be called IIM Mumbai. It's a welcome step. This institution was set up in 1963, around the same time that India set up its first two IIMs in Ahmedabad, which, as we know well, was promoted initially by the Sarabhai family, the Vikram Sarabhai family, and there was also the Indian Institute of Management, Kolkata or Calcutta. And after that, in different phases, other IIMs came in. So we had 20. Now with the Mumbai one also covered by the IIM Act with this amendment, we have 21. Now this is a demand which has been there for quite some time. This institution in Mumbai was set up in 1963 by the central government in partnership with UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, and ILO, International Labour Organization. There were many committees set up to look at how to elevate its level so it could issue degrees, etc., etc. In 2007, recommendations were made by respected Indian business leaders, including Anand Mahindra and Deepak Parekh, that this should be elevated into an IIM, and Dr. Manmohan Singh then, and his government, had promised to look into this. So that promise has now been fulfilled. That is the non-controversial part of these amendments. Non-controversial or non-debatable, let me say, parts of these amendments. Now, let's look at what is debatable and what will evoke quite a bit of debate. And it's our editorial view that this should evoke a lot of public debate, because education is very important. Higher education is supremely important. And among institutions of higher education in India, IIMs are among the most important. Now, that said, the first of all, and I'm not listing all the sections and subsections. I'm listing with you a soft copy of the original act, the Basic Act of 2017, a soft copy also of the proposed amendments now, and with the amendments also there is a note signed by the Education Minister, Dharmendra Pradhan, explaining why these amendments are being carried out, what is the objective behind this. So I told you there'll be 10 points. The first point was the redesignation and the change of status of the National Institute of Industrial Engineering in Mumbai, which now becomes an IIM. The next 9 points are the debatable ones. Number one, IIMs are now going to have the position of a visitor. Now, visitor in the higher education system, there's a pro-vice chancellor, vice chancellor, chancellor, right? And there is a visitor when such a position exists. So visitor is the topmost position. IIMs did not have one. Now they will have a visitor. All IIMs now will have a visitor, which is the topmost position in these institutions. It will be the same person who will be the visitor for all the IIMs. And that person will be the President of India, will be the incumbent President of India. So President of India will then be the visitor, will sit on top of all the IIMs. And you know what? President of India does not have any executive powers. So all of the actions, it follows that all of the actions that the President of India will take as visitor to any IIM will be drawn from the advice given by the Cabinet or the Education Ministry, particularly in this case. So this way, Education Ministry and Government of India now have the top authority, a topmost authority ruling over all the IIMs. So that is the first big change, and it's a big change. First point, a visitor has been appointed. Second point, that president permanently will be the visitor, the incumbent president. The third point, the chairman, the chairperson of the board of governors, the top executive body of an IIM is the board of governors. They are the ones who had all this autonomy. So in the existing system, originally the chairperson of the board of governors, very powerful position in an IIM, they were appointed by the existing board, right? That power is now gone. Now the chairperson will be nominated by the visitor, which means the President of India, which means Government of India, which means the Education Ministry. So that power to appoint the chairman of the Board of Governors, boards of governors of all the IIMs has now gone up to the Education Ministry. Fifth point pertains to the appointment of directors of IIMs. earlier the directors of IIMs were appointed by the board out of the panel, a panel recommended by a search and selection committee, S&SC Search and Selection Committee, which was in turn constituted by the board of governors of the IIM. So the board of governors of the IIM constituted a search and selection committee, which then picked a shortlist, a panel, and from which again the board of governors chose one to be the director of the institution. It's no longer the case now if this amendment passes. When this amendment passes, the procedure will be the same, but the director can only be appointed by the board of governors. Board of governors will still appoint the director, but it can only be done after the approval of the visitor. So first of all, the chairperson of the board of governors is a nominee of the visitor. Second, the appointment of the director, while the board picks one name out of the panel given by the search and selection committee, even that appointment will be made by the approval of the visitor. So once again, the central government gets power over the appointment. And there is one more twist on that, which takes us to our next point, point 6. So point 6 is what happens with search and selection committee. Search and selection committee, while we told you that the chairperson of the board now is appointed by the visitor, new director, even if appointed by the board, can only be done after clearance from the visitor. The search and selection committee also will now have one member nominated by the visitor. Visitor, which means president, which means your central government, which means the education ministry. So once again, that control comes back on the IIMs. Next point, the visitor, again the president, also now has the power to remove the director. Earlier that power remained with the board. Now the visitor, subject to certain conditions, the law says, you can read the law, subject to fulfillment of certain conditions, the visitor or the president can remove the director of an institute. 8th, board still has the power to remove a director, subject to fulfillment of many conditions, etc., etc. But they also cannot do it on their own anymore. So board can hire a director only with the prior approval of the visitor. The board can fire a director, but only with the prior approval of the visitor. So to hire and fire, both powers have now gone ultimately to the visitor, and through that to the education ministry in the central government. Then point number 9, section 17 in the original act has been deleted. Now section 17 gave the board of governors, the power in an IIM to initiate inquiry against the institute. And this inquiry was to be headed by a retired High Court judge. Now, what will substitute for this is not clear, at least not from these amendments. But I would say implicitly it looks like that this power will now rest with the visitor. But the visitor has the power to take action on these institutions and their directors, etc., etc. And finally, the 10th point is that there is an existing coordination forum for all institutions, all IIMs. This is in the section 29 of the original act. This coordination forum basically gets all the boards together, all the directors together, looks at what's common, what can they learn from each other. Usually, it looks like a relatively inconsequential motherhood and apple pie kind of institution, which gets them all together to share best practices, also see what problems are coming up, also recommend to the central government scholarships to weaker sections, etc., etc. But in the original format, in this coordination forum for all institutions, one eminent person was picked up by a selection committee constituted by the coordination forum. But now that position will also be picked up by the visitor. So once again, the central government gets an appointee there. Other members there who are ex officio, who in any case are members of that forum, include education secretary and central government and 2 secretaries in the relevant state. For example, if it's IIM Indore, it will be in Madhya Pradesh government, 2 secretaries from the ministries handling education who will rotate on an annual basis. So one for each year. So these are the changes that will come in also in this coordination forum. Now I know the question on your mind is the same as the question, on my mind that why has the government done it? Because they are the ones who brought in this reform. They were praised for it, and now they are reversing a lot of this reform. Why has this happened? So our correspondents tell me, and this is the buzz I pick also from the marketplace. Marketplace means from among people who've been sitting on these boards, etc., boards, chairpersons, that look, the education ministry has been feeling that boards have become too autonomous. Now from the education ministry, the buzz is that look, udhar nepotism is taking place, bhai bhatijawad jisko kehte hain, favoritism. The same guest lecturers, guest teachers, guest faculty are appearing in every institution. It looks like everybody has favorites, etc. So what is the solution for all the favoritism and all the ills in our society? That is to hand power back to the Indian civil services and to the Indian political class. A bit of that, this is opinion now, a bit of that is exactly what has happened in this case. Now, this has been going on since 2019. Since 2019, this has been discussed in the higher circles of the government. In fact, one of my colleagues, Saurav Roy Burman, he had filed an RTI in 2022 asking what was happening, asking specific questions on the search and selection procedure at the IIMs. And I will share with you the reply that he got, and please read the second para. It's a reply from Secretary to Education Ministry, Sanjay Murthy, K. Sanjay Murthy. And the second para, I will read it for you. It's also on your screen because that tells you, one, what the thought process was, because this para itself tells you that the government intended to make far-reaching changes. And second, it also gives you an insight, an implicit insight as to why this has happened. And this para is keeping in view the importance of the position of chairperson of the IIM and higher education ecosystem of the country. It may be beneficial to have suggestions of all IIMs. Accordingly, it is advised that we undertake the above consultation before finalizing the search and selection committee for chairperson. You may request the members of the boards of governors to send their suggestions regarding this mail to us. This is a letter written by the Education Secretary Sanjay Murthy, not to our correspondent. It's a letter written by Education Secretary K. Sanjay Murthy to members of boards of governors of all IIMs. And that gave us an idea, that gives us an idea of where this thought process is coming from.